friends, grateful that you're here. Today we're going to do a monthly wrap-up. So it's interesting because I feel like April started off quite slow. Ivana and Kat came over in the beginning of the month, and so I was just like not in a reading space. I also feel like, what was going on in the beginning of April? I feel like stuff was going on in the beginning of April and I was just not in a reading space. But then I did a 24-hour reading vlog, which absolutely catapulted my reading. I read a bunch of bangers. That will be up soon. And yeah, it was just like once you start and everything is just a banger, you want to keep going. So it was a good month. We read, I think, 8 books. There was 1 DNF. But yeah, let's get into it. The first book that we read in April was The Possessions by Annie Ernaux. This was a buddy read with Kat from Lit with Kat, and we were just like screaming at each other in the iMessages because I don't know how she does it. Annie Ernaux captures these moments that we all have, right? Like breakup. But there are all these little tiny, minute details that we experience, right? The undignified moments that she captures so well. And I was just like this the whole time because I've been there. So this teeny little book recounts the end of her relationship with her partner, and she ends the relationship and then he sort of jumps into a new relationship, and she's sort of talking about the jealousy and hyperfixation that she sort of falls into about this new partner. So she talks about seeing her everywhere and needing to know all the information, and there's just this like buildup of like the most encompassing and consuming sense of curiosity about a person. And yeah, it was just the end of a relationship and all of the ugly things that are so small that we don't really think of them as events, but that she makes events. Ernaux is again super sharp in her rendering of these experiences, which makes this super not emotional, but I felt wrung out. And I think what was really cool about this book is she sort of builds this up, right? And then there's one point where she's like, and you know what's funny is that if this man turned around and said, yeah, I'll take you back, I wouldn't even want him. I would be so exhausted and so just depleted of obsessing that I wouldn't even want it. What I find absolutely intoxicating is that she sifts through all of these like really heightened emotions that we've all probably felt, but we don't want to admit. So like those undignified moments, and she puts them up to light, and she does it in a very, I feel like the clarity and the crispness with which she writes gives it a sort of authority, or at least the permission to stand tall and to stand in light. It's moments that I know I have buried, and to sort of see them taken out of the dirt and presented in this way is just like an experience. Positive, negative, distressing, whatever, an experience. I just really enjoy Annie Ernaux's work. So it was a great read. Annie Ernaux can do no wrong. Maybe she can, but she hasn't up to this point with me. So yeah. Another book that I picked up in April was Whereabouts by Jhumpa Lahiri. I literally just came back from book club discussing this book. I think this might be my favorite Jhumpa Lahiri book. This is a book about an unnamed character who is observing the relationships around her, and we sort of feel a sense of her inability to connect with others, her residing in the peripheries of these relationships. But also, so it was interesting because I think the discussion that really came about this book was the sort of dichotomy or tension between feeling lonely and solitude, and if those things are the same or if they lend to the same sort of feeling. Because there's a line where she talks about trying to cultivate her solitude and it being something that plagues her. She does sort of relate and talk about her proximity to all of these relationships, but we never see her connect. And then there are just like these moments where like someone who's doing her nails touches her and she wishes for that person to hold on a little bit longer. And so there's a sense of trying to cultivate solitude, I think, as a way to sort of individuate from her parents, because her mother is someone who's quite fearful of loneliness, and her father is someone who sought loneliness. So that sort of relationship is interesting too. Is it like, are you replicating patterns of your parents? Are you doing things in spite of your parents? How much impact do your parents have on your personhood as an adult? How do you connect? How do you attach yourself to these we's that already exist? Or how do you make yourself a we with someone else? This book felt like when you're trying to put a necklace on and you keep missing the clasp, but in human connection form. Like, that's just what this felt to me. It was written during the pandemic, although Jhumpa says that that's not really what impacted her. Jhumpa writes all her books in Italian. I was just thinking, like, it must feel, not that Italian is the first time that she feels sort of alienated or othered, but that's a sort of heightened sense of it, you know, living in a new language. But it was just a beautiful, beautiful book about attempting connection. Loved it. All right, then I read The Friend by Sigrid Nunez, and this, I sat down. So this is really what pulled me out of my slump. I sat down and I could not stop reading it until I finished it, which is such a nice feeling. I'm not a big marathoner. This month I've done a lot of them, but that's typically not my like pace of reading. This was lovely. So this was about a woman who had a friend who died by suicide, had a dog, and essentially our narrator inherits the dog. And we sort of see them work through grief together, her and the dog, and her sort of coming to relate to this animal, how they partner to sort of save each other. It was beautiful, but this book is also about writers. If you dedicate your life to art and that art is misunderstood, where do you sort of go from there? I also really do like how this handled grief. I think that it wasn't Pollyanna-esque. The writer was rendered within his negatives and his positives, and so it just felt very honest. I really enjoyed this. I started looking up how to get a dog in my apartment, even though I'm not allowed, because I was just like, oh, I want an Apollo. It was so tender. It was so beautiful to see this relationship between our speaker and this dog. I definitely recommend this book. I actually picked up Sigrid Nunez's other book, I don't remember the name, but apparently it's a continuation of this, so I'm very excited to pick that up. So the next book I read was First Love by Gwendoline Riley, and that was a book. What was that book about? So First Love was a look at a marriage that was dissolving, looking at the relationships that our speaker had before, but also looking at her parents and sort of just like this character study of all these different people in her life and how sort of terrible everyone was. Her father especially was like a really heinous person, and you start to wonder like how her mother sort of ended up in that partnership. But then there are some parallels between the relationship that her parents had and the relationship that she finds herself in. I thought it was sort of looking at how patterns replicate themselves even in really like toxic situations. Yeah, it was just about toxic people. And even our writer, I think, was a little bit terrible too. So it was just a book about terrible people and terrible relationships and how you sort of find your way out of those. If you find your way out of those, it was a really fast read. It was very dialogue heavy. My blood pressure spiked through the roof while I was reading that because I did not like how her husband was speaking to her. But yeah, just an interesting little character study that I enjoyed. I would read more Gwendoline Riley. Women Talking is a book that I started at the end of April and finished like beginning of May, but I'm gonna slip it in here because I know that if I keep this book to the next wrap up, I'm not gonna remember anything about it. But essentially, because this book was wild, essentially this is about a Mennonite community. There are these assaults that were happening. The men were drugging women and raping them, and women would wake up with like blood and fluids all over them in pain. This is actually based on a true story. It's based on a Mennonite community in Bolivia. Yo, I was shook the whole time. Shook. There were attempts on the men's lives as like retributive action, and to protect the men they were sent to prison. It takes place over the span of 2 days, and we're seeing these women gather and try to see what would be the correct action to take in light of all the events that have happened to them. This was such a fascinating book, and I also read this with Kat, and we were talking about how in this book there was no action, and even the action that does take place within the span of the 2 books is never shown. So this is purely like a philosophical Socratic book on ideas. So they have 3 options. They have do nothing, which they sort of interrogate and say, well, you can't do nothing. You're making a choice, right? So it's either do nothing, stay and fight, or leave. They're sort of bringing in theory and religion and talking about like forgiveness. Are we betraying ourselves by becoming violent? In leaving, what does that mean? And they were talking because, so one of the conditions was if they stayed, the men had to ask for forgiveness and they had to forgive the men. And they were sort of interrogating like, what is the theoretical underpinning of forgiveness? Does that even exist in this situation? Can we feel non-violence in this situation? A fascinating book. I adore books about ideas. Like nothing needs to happen. Let's just talk. So they sort of create like this manifesto, and they were saying that the things that they want to do is they want to be able to think, they want to be able to talk. And there was one other thing that I don't remember, but I thought it was such an interesting play because oftentimes when you think about women talking, you think it's just like gossip, and there was gossip in this, but gossip was like purposeful and important. I really enjoyed this. I also didn't know that Miriam Toews was also in a Mennonite community. I'm so curious to read more of Miriam Toews. Okay, then I read Lucy by Jamaica Kincaid. So I've said this before, but I read A Small Place and I really enjoyed that. And this was, I think, my first novel by her. This was about a young girl who moves somewhere and she works for this family. And as the story goes on, you sort of see her avoid her mother and why she feels rageful towards her mother. We sort of see her also trying to connect, but I think here it's just like interrogating this really tense-filled mother-daughter relationship. We also see her navigate her relationships with men. I thought the writing was stunning. The nature writing in this beautiful. I thought it was very complex. I thought she danced around taboo, or maybe she dove into taboo. I thought this was really, really well done and really beautiful, and I'm super excited to pick up. I think I'm gonna pick up Annie John next, but really love this. And then I read The Lovers. Well, I started to read The Lovers by Marguerite Duras. How do you pronounce that? And this felt pretty similar. So we were interrogating in The Lovers this young girl's relationship to her family. So she had some brothers and her mom, and she had a lot of critique about her mother, a lot of judgment towards her mother. But I felt, and I don't know if it's because it's translated or maybe because it's the first foray into this, and so maybe it's been better developed in books like Lucy, but this didn't feel effective to me. This book, I think she was just throwing out unsayable feelings without really like explaining why. Or honestly, I started to skim this at some point, but I was like, because you guys are in poverty, you hate your mom? Okay. Maybe I didn't give it the full chance, and maybe I will reread it at some point. But just reading this after reading this, I thought the anger in mother-daughter relationships was so well done in this that this felt really haphazard and ineffective. So if you want complex mother-daughter relationships, I would definitely point you towards Jamaica Kincaid. The last book I read was The Clothing of Books. After I read Whereabouts, I was on a Jhumpa Lahiri kick, and I ordered In Other Words, and I ordered Clothing of Books because I was listening to a podcast and she was talking about this little essay. And this was something about how authors don't really have much say in the covers of their books, which I thought was interesting. I didn't know that. She talks about how in Europe there are like uniformed books and what it means to be a uniformed book versus what it means to have covers that like don't represent you. Just a very interesting little booklet on the publishing industry and what it means to have covers to your books that you absolutely abhor. There's one part where she says, "There is a certain awful cover for one of my books that elicits in me an almost violent response. Every time I am asked to autograph that edition, I feel the impulse to rip the cover off the book." And I opened a poll up on my IG stories and I was like, which one do we think it is? But I think that's fascinating. I think that the idea that you are represented by this cover, because that's the first sort of point of interaction between a reader and a book, and to feel that sort of strong sense of dislike for something is interesting to me. I don't quite understand why authors are not given more, or maybe they are to certain degrees in certain publishing houses. Like I remember reading about Durga's book, Durga Chiboz's Too Much and Not the Mood, and I feel like she had some say or some involvement in the selection of that cover, but I don't know if that's the norm. But I think it's interesting. Authors are sort of arriving at their covers the same way a reader might be encountering it. They're sort of stranger to it in the process. So just thought it was a super fascinating little read. And then I have been slowly making my way through the Paris review, baby's first Paris review. But yeah, really enjoying this, really liking making my way through this slowly. But yeah, that was it. Those were the books that I read in April. What was your favorite read of the month? Do you have one? Let me know. But I think that's it. Bye.